Thanks very much, Tim, and thanks to those of you who came back after lunch. I think we probably made the right decision to get some lunch before starting to talk again. I'm going to start by talking about fossil fuel use in our farms and why we might want to try to reduce our fossil fuel use. Because, of course, there are economic reasons, there are environmental reasons for doing so. From an economic perspective, reducing fossil energy use can reduce costs, but it doesn't always reduce costs. Energy typically hasn't been a big part of farm costs. It varies tremendously from one type of operation to another, but overall we're looking at maybe 10 to 15% of farm costs. Now, if we can, and very often the energy that we use, the fossil fuels that we use, substitute for labor, which has been a major cost on our farms. So if we look at systems that require more labor in order to save energy, that can be more expensive. I also want to make a point that from an economic perspective, our economy is always changing. Input prices are always changing. Land prices, labor prices, energy prices are always changing. And what might make sense today doesn't necessarily make sense tomorrow, particularly as energy costs increase relative to other input costs. Now, in addition to the sometimes potential to reduce costs in our current economy, there's the potential to reduce risk in the future. So that by learning to farm without depending so much on fossil fuels, we have a more secure farming system. When we see spikes like the one in 2008, we're maybe not as vulnerable to those increases, rapid increases in costs. We're somewhat independent of energy prices. So there are those for whom the economic reasons are the most important. There are also those for whom environmental reasons are very important. And among the community of organic growers, I work with a lot of people who are concerned about the impact of their farming system on the environment. Certainly, by reducing our fossil fuel use, we can reduce carbon emissions from our farms. We can reduce the impact associated with fossil fuel extraction and burning. And I guess when I was talking about the economics and saying that what makes sense today may not make sense tomorrow, my underlying assumption is that energy prices are likely to increase in the future. That we're going to have to learn to operate under energy constraints that we haven't experienced over the last 50 or 75 years. I want to put our farming systems in context here. So I'm going to put these in context of the entire US economy. And so this slide shows US energy consumption by source between 1775 and 2006. Now, you can see in the first 100 years or so of the country's history, we were using very little energy, and most of it came from renewable sources. Most of it was biomass. We kind of tapped into coal sometime around 1850, and our coal consumption really took off, and then leveled out between maybe 1900 and about 1975 before it started to increase again. Petroleum came next, and really petroleum is the dominant energy source that we rely on in this country. Our petroleum consumption has increased fairly rapidly over the last 100 years or so. We see natural gas, and our natural gas consumption leveled off for a while and is now increasing again. We see nuclear here, and then there's a whole bunch of other renewable energy sources: hydro, geothermal, solar, wind, and biomass. Now, even though biomass was the dominant energy source early in the country's history, none of these renewable sources play a very prominent role in today's energy economy. These are minor energy sources relative to our fossil fuels. Now, if you add all of those lines together, add all those numbers up, this is what you get. Here's US energy consumption in exajoules. Exajoules would be a metric term. It's very equivalent, or it's almost the same as about a quadrillion BTU. So that's our axis right here. And this is between 1950 and 2009 would be right here. What we see between 1950 and about 1972 is exponential increase in energy use in this country. Every year we were using more energy than the year before, and not only that, but the increase was greater every year than the year before. In about 1972, 73, we had the first oil price shock, supply reduction and increase in prices, and our consumption stopped growing and actually started to fall off. We had another oil price shock in the late 70s, and again, our consumption fell off. So that by 1986, we really weren't using any more energy as a nation than in 1973. We saw a decade of without consistent increases in energy consumption. After 86, our energy consumption started to grow again, but there was a difference between post-86 and pre-73. After 86, we were using more energy each year than the year before, but the amount by which our increases occurred was getting less and less each year. So we've actually seen, even prior to the most recent energy price shock, we were seeing our energy consumption level off. In fact, on a per capita basis in this country, energy use hit its peak in 1979. Each individual in this country has been using less energy since 1979. In 2008, of course, we saw a dramatic energy price spike, and energy consumption fell off dramatically in 2008 and again in 2009. Now, today we're sitting somewhere around $90 barrel oil. In fact, there's a dramatic difference between prices in Europe and North America right now. It's about $97 in Europe. It's about $86 in the United States. And this is a record price gap between those two prices. But we're sitting around 90, which would have been a crisis prior to 2008. I guess after experiencing a year in which prices shot up to 140, it's almost expected. So where do we go from here? And of course, that's an open question. I can't pretend to predict the future. Nobody else can either. The Energy Information Administration tries. It issues reports every year telling us where they think our energy consumption is going. And about a year ago, this is what they were saying. Now, in the most recent report, they've modified that fairly dramatically and downward. They now expect that we will no longer be seeing growth in energy consumption in the United States. And it's been really interesting to watch the forecasts from the Energy Information Administration, because year after year, they're downgrading their forecasts. They're expecting us to use less and less simply because the energy isn't available. You can see that if we were to follow this line, we would see a plateau and perhaps an eventual decline in the near future anyway. And there are certainly those who expect more years of energy price hikes, energy price shocks, and expect to see a fairly rapid decline in energy consumption in the United States in the near future. I don't know which of these is most correct. Now, how does this relate to agriculture? You see, we've seen dramatic changes in U.S. agriculture in the past century or so. This graph runs from 1900 to 2000. A century of U.S. agriculture. Here's the U.S. farm population in 1900 at about 30 million farmers. And of course, we all know that after the Second World War, the number of farmers started to fall off, and fell off for most of the past 60 years or so. Now, at the same time as we were losing farmers, we were losing farmland. So here's U.S. farmland in tens of millions of hectares. We're looking from 50 down to about 40 over the last 40, 50 years. For much of the last century, we made up for decreases in available farmland and available farm labor by adopting more energy-intensive technologies. And direct farm energy use increased fairly steadily from maybe 1910 through to about 1979. After 1979, though, our energy use plateaued and even began to fall. Now, direct energy use. This is the actual diesel fuel, the natural gas that's used on the farm, the gasoline, all of that energy that's used directly on the farm. That is one piece of the energy picture when we're looking at agriculture. Indirect energy use is also very important. And this is all of the energy that goes into producing the inputs that we use on our farm. So we're not directly using that energy on the farm, we're using it before it ever gets to the farm. Indirect energy use, I only have data that goes back to maybe 1965 or so, but you can see that it pretty much mirrors direct energy use, but it's a very substantial difference between direct and indirect energy use. Overall, with direct and indirect combined, we're still seeing a peak in 1979 and a subsequent decline. Now, throughout that time, our corn yields increased fairly steadily. So this is grain corn in tons per hectare, and you can see that the drop in energy use, the drop in available farmland, the drop in farmers didn't affect the steady increase in corn output. Now, of course, corn is a crop that is very important to the US farm economy, and it's one that we all track fairly regularly. Let's look at some other, perhaps more minor crops. Let's look at potatoes in tons per hectare. And you see exactly the same thing. Now, what's interesting about the corn is that we're constantly adopting new varieties. There are constant breeding programs, developing more efficient varieties of corn that are being released into our market. That isn't the case with potatoes. With potatoes, we're dealing with much the same varieties that we were growing 100 years ago. Even so, even with declines in farmland, farm population, and energy use, we're seeing steady increases in land use efficiency, in potato yield. Now, it's not just potatoes. We see the same thing with onions. And really, we can look at one crop after another, and we see very similar patterns. We've been able to consistently increase output despite these declining inputs. Now, I think that land, labor, and energy can be considered key inputs to our farming systems. And really, for the past 30 years, since 1979 or so, US farmers have been making more efficient use of all three. Compared to other parts of the world, US farmers tend to use more land. We've got a lot of land compared to, say, Europe or Africa. And we tend to use less labor. Honestly, our labor costs tend to be high, particularly compared to developing countries. Relative to other industrialized countries, we tend to use less energy. And then relative to developing countries, we tend to use more energy. So our US farm, from an energy perspective, we're sitting somewhere in the middle. Now, how is that energy being used on our farms? And I want to make the point here that I want to say, notice the scale here. This is in quadrillion BTU. And I said that a quadrillion BTU is almost exactly the same as an exajoule, which was the scale I used on that national energy use graph that I showed you. You may remember that we were plateauing. We were peaking out right around 100 exajoules. Now, you see that farm energy use peaked at somewhere around 2.5 quadrillion BTU. And we're sitting very close to 2 quadrillion BTU. So really, our farms are using just 2% of the energy that's being consumed in this nation as a whole. And how is this energy being used, and how has this changed? These are data from John Miranowski at Iowa State University, and he shows that, that really we've seen a shift over the past 40 years or so from gasoline to diesel, and that probably isn't a surprise. We've seen an increase in electricity consumption on our farms. We've seen a decrease in natural gas and liquid petroleum gas. And we've seen a fairly substantial and steady increase in fertilizer and pesticide use that capped out around 1980 and then started to fall off as we figured out how to farm without so many fertilizers and pesticides. Now, from an indirect energy perspective, the key player in this bottom part of the picture is nitrogen fertilizer. Fixing nitrogen fertilizer requires a lot of energy. And probably most of this is the energy required to fix nitrogen fertilizer. You can see that when you look at our farms as a whole, that nitrogen fertilizer fixation, and other fertilizers and pesticides, but it's mostly nitrogen. And we're looking at better than 30% of the energy that goes into our whole farming system. The farming system, of course, is only a small part of the food system. And our farming system is also bigger than our food system, in that particularly recently, our farms have been producing corn for feedstock, for biofuels, that's never going to be eaten by a person. But here I want to concentrate on what it takes to feed people in this country. And these data are just recently released. This was a report by USDA economists, Patrick Canning and his team, released this report in 2010, Energy Use in the US Food System. Now, they found that farming, agriculture, accounted for just 2% of energy use in the food system, which is exactly what John Miranowski was reporting in the data that I just showed you. But agriculture is just a small part of what it takes to get food to our plate. Very often, when I talk to people about energy use in the food system, and I ask them where they think the energy is going, what springs to mind is trucking food around, moving food, food transportation. And particularly, there's been a move towards a preference for local products. And the thought that if we can reduce the transportation element of our food systems, that we can dramatically reduce the energy that goes into getting food to our plate. Well, what Patrick Canning is showing, and his team is showing, is that that really isn't the case. That transportation is probably the smallest component of the food system energy use, at about 0.6% of our total energy economy. So where is the energy going? Well, it's going to processing food at 2.8%, packaging food at almost 1%, wholesale and retail running our grocery stores, food service running our restaurants, our fast food outlets, our cafeterias. And what's the biggest chunk of food system energy use? It's the household. It's running our refrigerators, it's running our stoves and our microwaves, our dishwashers, our bread makers, our food processors, all of the other conveniences of a modern kitchen. That's the biggest piece of our food system energy use. And so you can see from this chart that if we're concerned about energy use in society, and that the food system really does make up a big chunk of the energy used in our society at maybe 14.5%. But farmers don't have a whole lot of control over that energy use. Who really has the power to change things is consumers. I want to compare these data for the United States to some other surveys done in other industrialized countries. First, in Sweden, a recent look, this is published in 2009, a recent look at Sweden's food system concluded that the farming system, the agricultural system, accounted for about 2.5% of national energy use, and the food system was about 13%, very similar to the United States. This, before the 2010 study, Heller and Keolian's study in 2000 was the most recent for the US. Back then, they were saying 2.1% for agriculture, 10% for the food system. In the United Kingdom, 2007, we're looking at 2005 data, 1.9% for agriculture, 11% for the food system. And here's the most recent data for the United States. It's remarkably similar between these other industrialized economies. So given that agriculture is a small piece of the energy pie, and that even when we're just looking at the food system, not the entire economy, agriculture is still only maybe 15% of food system energy use. There are still opportunities for us to make changes that will have some dramatic implications for food system energy use. And that's because really the numbers that I'm showing you, or that I have shown you, are averages for the food system as a whole. There are examples of agricultural operations that are much more energy intensive than average, and there are also examples of ways of farming that are less energy intensive. The more energy intensive systems include livestock production systems. Honestly, when we look at where our energy is going in the agriculture component of that system, an awful lot of it is going to livestock. An awful lot of the grain that we produce in this country is going into feeding our animals. From a horticulture perspective, heated greenhouses end up taking up far more energy than field systems. If we're growing tomatoes in a greenhouse, we're looking at about 30 times, even more, 30 times as much energy per tomato coming out of that greenhouse as opposed to a field-grown tomato. Plasticulture is also energy intensive, particularly when we're using plastic mulch that's put into the landfill at the end of each year. That plastic really has an energy content that's similar to diesel fuel in terms of how much you could get out of that plastic if you burned it on a weight basis. And then we have systems, agricultural systems, that are less energy intensive, and these would include our grain farms, which are remarkably efficient systems. Our organic farms, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that because there's been a focus on organic production this morning. Now, there is some research which suggests that small farming systems can be more energy efficient than larger farms. I think the jury's still out on that. And the question, too, is can direct marketing be more energy efficient than a more centralized food distribution system? I think that if we focus solely on transportation, then there probably isn't much difference. The one advantage to direct marketing, perhaps, is that it encourages people to cook with or to prepare unprocessed foods and unpackaged foods, and that's where we start to see the advantage to direct marketing. It's not necessarily because the food is traveling less to get to your plate. I also want to make the point that in most of our economy, energy and greenhouse gas emissions are almost one and the same, okay? If we look at the society as a whole, and if we're concerned about greenhouse gas emissions, it means reducing energy use. That's not true in agriculture. If we look at the greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural systems, our energy use is tiny, but our greenhouse gas emissions tend to be much larger than our energy use would suggest. So here, this is the energy component of our greenhouse gas emissions in this economy, and that includes the energy used by our farming systems, okay? But that's really just going to be 2% of all of this energy that's being used in the society. On top of that energy, we've got this slice of the chart that is the greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture. And according to the EPA, those greenhouse gas emissions are coming mainly from agricultural soil management. This is methane and nitrous oxides coming from our soils. There's also a sizable chunk coming from enteric fermentation. This is ruminant digestive systems, mostly methane. And then manure management. Again, it's methane and it's nitrous oxides. Now those compounds, the methane, for example, every molecule of methane has 21 times as much global warming potential as a molecule of carbon dioxide. So it doesn't take much to really have a big effect. And our agricultural systems are not major contributors to our carbon dioxide emissions from energy use, but they are fairly major contributors to our methane and nitrous oxide emissions. They also have the potential to be major contributors to carbon sequestration and to reducing carbon emissions and greenhouse gas emissions. The US farm segment of the economy is relatively small. And yet, I think that we can have goals for our farms that would probably be unrealistic for the economy as a whole. I think it's realistic, achievable to set goals of net energy production from US farms and net carbon sequestration. There's no reason that we need to be dependent on fossil fuels or emitting greenhouse gases. Already we've seen some dramatic successes in the past 30 years. And you saw that from Miranowski's data. We've reduced fertilizer and pesticide use. We're making our inputs more efficiently. We've switched from gasoline to diesel, which has fairly dramatically reduced our energy use and our fossil fuel use. We've increased yields fairly steadily, and there's been a reduction in tillage. And from a soil carbon sequestration perspective, that reduced tillage is very important. We're storing more carbon in the soil. There's much yet to do, and there's great potential here. We can develop systems that really close resource loops and capture energy. And the background here is a methane digester on a dairy farm. This is one such system. So in fact, instead of having a waste product, that waste is going into a methane digester. It's producing methane, which can then be burnt to generate electricity. It's by capturing that methane, you're not releasing it into the atmosphere. You're reducing greenhouse gas emissions. You're also creating power that you can then use on our farms. And as you saw, our farms are increasingly dependent on electricity. There's potential to reduce energy use through organic conversion. There's potential to reduce energy use by reintegrating animal and plant production systems, by using solar greenhouses or passively heated greenhouses such as high tunnels rather than heated greenhouses. And as we increase our yields and make more efficient use of land, there's potential to actually return some of our farmland to nature, which has a dramatic impact when it comes to storing carbon, increasing biodiversity, and accomplishing some of these other environmental objectives. Agriculture has the potential to contribute to that. Since we've been talking about organic agriculture, I want to talk about the comparison between organic and conventional in terms of energy use. And I can say that organic systems are usually, but not always, more energy efficient than conventional systems. And so I just show here perhaps the relative energy efficiency of the conventional system in dark blue and the organic system in light blue. You can certainly find examples of organic farms that are using more energy for what they produce than a conventional farm. They may be the outliers, but they exist. And those exceptions are informative because there are practices that are allowed under the organic guidelines that can be very energy intensive. For example, we can use heated greenhouses on organic farms. Now, in the field and in greenhouses, organic yields tend to be slightly lower, not a whole lot lower, but slightly lower than conventional systems. In the field, when you look at yield on an energy basis, use of energy in terms of yield efficiency, it usually looks better for the organic systems. They're getting more out of each unit of energy. Even though their yields are slightly lower, they've reduced their energy consumption enough that it comes out in favor of the organic. But that isn't true in the greenhouses because these greenhouses are using so much energy anyway. So any tiny decrease in yield by going to an organic greenhouse has a dramatic impact on energy use efficiency. Flame weeding is, of course, a system or a technology that's allowed in organic production systems. This is basically using liquid propane burners to heat weeds to the point where their cells rupture. And this is a very energy-intensive technology. It probably wouldn't make sense from an economic perspective in most conventional farms, but it's used on organic farms because that extra price premium allows somebody to use a fairly expensive and energy-intensive technology. Very often, inputs that are approved for organic production are not widely available. And there may be central distribution sources. I might have to order my organic seed from California, or my BT or Safer soap from some distant supplier. Now, I wouldn't be doing that if I were a conventional producer, because suppliers would be close by. But if I'm shipping inputs from all over the country in order to comply with those organic standards, that's going to have an energy cost. Now, the reason that organic systems tend to be less energy intensive than conventional is almost always due to the fact that organic producers find alternatives to synthetic nitrogen fertilizer. So here are some data from pasture systems. This is data published in 2003. And you can see we have the organic system here and the conventional system here. This would be a grazing-only system. Here's a 1 cut of hay plus grazing, organic and conventional. 2 cuts with grazing, organic and conventional. 4 cuts, organic and conventional, no grazing. Now, if you look at where that energy is going, the bottom chunk of this bar is diesel fuel. And in every case, the organic farms are actually using more diesel fuel. They're spending more time on the tractor than the conventional farms. Okay? The top chunk is other indirect energy use. And in every case, it's bigger on the organic farms than the conventional farms. So what makes the difference is the nitrogen fertilizer. There's your nitrogen fertilizer in the middle. And in every case, that bumps the conventional farms up higher than the organic farms. There have been a number of reviews published looking at energy efficiency in organic versus conventional systems. Here are our broad conclusions from 3 of those reviews. Back in 2000, Stoltz is saying that in most field trials and studies of operating farms, the increase in yield for conventional production does not offset the extra energy used. So yields are higher in the conventional farms, but not high enough to justify the energy that goes into those conventional systems. Zeismer, this is with the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, says that organic typically is using 30 to 50% less energy in production than comparable conventional agriculture. And now, it's using 30 to 50% more energy. Very often, the yield is maybe 80% of the conventional yield. And so, again, the difference ends up in favor of the organic systems there. Now, it's using energy efficiently, but requires more labor. And in 2008, Gamiero et al. Are finding that organic agriculture performs much better than conventional in terms of energy efficiency on an output over input basis. So that takes yield into consideration. Now, what's interesting, the Zeismeyer review from the Food and Agriculture Organization is saying that because of its reduced energy inputs, organic agriculture is the ideal production method for biofuels. As the aim of biofuels is to reduce dependency on non-renewable energy sources and to mitigate environmental damage of fossil fuel emissions, organic production of biofuels furthers these goals in a way that conventional agriculture does not. Now, I find this fascinating. I think that organic producers who are generally used to receiving premium prices for their products are probably not all that likely to find those price premiums on the commodity markets where our biofuel feedstock crops are sold. But it is true, of course, that the energy inputs of biofuel production are very important, and that the farming segment of those energy inputs tends to be a fairly major component. And if we're really interested in efficient biofuel production, we probably need to look at finding ways to avoid nitrogen fertilizer in our feedstock production systems. Yes?
Where's the data for this? I find it hard to believe because many of the biofuel sources are grasses, C3 and C4 grasses. These are well known to be voracious nitrogen users. I just don't. I'd like to see the data.
Right, right. Well, there are data in this review paper, and so I encourage you to look this up. And of course, in the United States, the dominant feedstock for our biofuels is corn that's used for ethanol. Okay, corn is of course a voracious nitrogen consumer, just as you say, and it's that all of the nitrogen that goes into the system contributes to the fact that we're getting very little extra energy out in relation to the energy that's going in. So yes, I think that your point is well made. Nitrogen is a key component of the high yields that we're getting from these grass systems. But it's also key to the fact that we're using so much energy to produce these grasses. And if we can find ways to avoid that nitrogen use, then there's potential to have more efficient biofuel production, even though our yields will be down. Now, if we're looking at, how am I doing for time? Okay. If we're looking at replacing fossil fuels on the farm, in our conventional industrial agriculture system, fertilizers and pesticides are accounting for about a third of the energy use. This is the indirect energy component of our farming systems. Of course, some of the tactics that were discussed this morning offer opportunities to get away from that synthetic nitrogen specifically. So if we can find legumes to replace synthetic nitrogen fixation, if we can reconnect crop and animal production so that the nitrogen from our animal wastes is being put back on our crop systems, then there's potential to reduce nitrogen use. And that's the biggie if we're looking at farm energy use. Now, there's also potential to reduce pesticide use. Pesticide production is an energy-intensive process, but we tend to use very little pesticide in terms of on a weight basis. And so reducing pesticide use doesn't offer nearly the advantage that reducing nitrogen use does in terms of indirect energy use. But of course, we can use diversity, resistant varieties, place-appropriate production systems, biological controls, botanicals, all of the integrated pest management tactics to reduce pesticide use on our farms, and that's going to play into this. Diesel fuel is a big component of our agricultural energy use, and there is certainly potential to produce biodiesel on farm from our agricultural oilseed crops. When we look at the energy inputs versus outputs of biodiesel, it tends to be a much more energy efficient process than ethanol, even though a lot of the subsidies in this country have promoted ethanol as a biofuel. But we can reduce diesel fuel use by using equipment that's sized for the task. Really, large tractors and large farm machinery can be tremendously efficient when they're used for big jobs. They're very inefficient if we use them for small jobs. So generally, we want to use the smallest tractor that we have available that will do the job. Machinery maintenance is key to reducing diesel use. And there's also the opportunity to go to draft power and human power, particularly in our smaller farming systems. Now, the research that's coming out on draft power is fascinating because, the great thing about a tractor is that when you're done with it, you can turn it off. You can't turn a horse off. It keeps eating, right? And so, so the draft systems can be more energy efficient if you just look at that time when the horse is actually doing the work as compared to the tractor. But if you look at feeding that horse the whole year, the tractor starts to have a big advantage in terms of energy use. And if we're going to use draft animals effectively and efficiently, we have to use them constantly. A little demonstration where you're using a draft animal once in a while in order to show that you can farm with horses isn't a terribly energy efficient system. You really need to use those draft animals day in and day out as much as possible to justify the energy that's going into feeding them. Our farms are increasingly dependent on electricity. There are also opportunities to generate electricity on the farm using solar, wind, hydro, biomass. Now, each of these the opportunities are site-specific. Something that makes sense on one farm is not going to make sense on another farm. But there are certainly ways in which we can be generating our own electricity. Now, I told you about the comparison between greenhouse and field production. This is some of these data. This is from Annika Karlsson-Kanyama, who's a researcher in Sweden, looking at the energy that goes into a serving of fresh field tomatoes. That's about 88 calories. And calories are an interesting unit. A calorie with a big C is the same as a kilocalorie, which is 1,000 calories with a little c. It's very confusing. I don't know. But anyway, the 88 of those compared to about 15 calories that you get from actually eating the tomato. Okay. Compare that to canned tomatoes. Of course, that canning process is energy intensive, 177 calories going in, still 15 coming out from eating it. Compare that to greenhouse tomatoes. She's finding about 1,000 calories going into every tomato. That's a big difference between the field and the greenhouse production. And that's a great motivation then to promote high tunnels and row covers as opposed to heated systems. Particularly in this part of the world, we can do an awful lot with high tunnels, passive solar systems that don't require any fossil fuel heat. This is Ken Waters, and I took these pictures because I visited his farm on March 24th of 2009. He had these tomatoes, that were already 3 feet high or so. This is a passively solar heated system. There's no fossil fuel heat going into that high tunnel. And then he has extra row covers that he lowers over those at night and then brings them back up so they can get a little extra light during the day. I was just kind of impressed because here it was the beginning of March and he was starting to pick his first ripe tomatoes without any fossil fuel heat. If we look at heated greenhouses in the tomato system, if you put in a new plant right around Christmas time, you can start to harvest your first ripe tomatoes in a heated greenhouse somewhere around the beginning of March. Now, I think that Ken Waters' early March tomatoes in a high tunnel, that's sort of unusual for this part of the world, but we can realistically expect to see ripe tomatoes in early to mid-May in a high tunnel. And then we can do a shoulder season and have ripe tomatoes right through to December in a high tunnel, which really complements the field production system where we might see our ripe tomatoes around the beginning of July and then they're all gone by maybe October or so. So using high tunnels and the field together, we can pretty much produce tomatoes for a season that's very similar to what we can get from heated greenhouses. Now, taking high tunnels a step further, this is a passive solar seed starting house in North Carolina. You can see that rather than just having poly over the plants, this is a sloped south-facing wall of glass. And then here's a heat-retaining roof and wall, a thick insulating wall in order to act as a heat sink. And then there are also black barrels full of water underneath the benches in this particular system to really retain as much of this heat as possible so that without fossil fuels, they can start producing their transplants in January, February, really early in the season using passive heat. Now that's North Carolina. This is what they're doing in China. This is really taking the same technology that we just saw and expanding it, scaling up. So we have a south-facing wall with poly on the south side here. You've got a very thick wall on the north side that acts as a heat sink. You've got a little bit of an overhang over here on the north roof, again, to try and retain some of this heat. And then what's interesting about these systems, this is a single layer of poly, but at nighttime, they are rolling down a straw insulating blanket to keep the heat in at night. And then they roll that back up in the daytime in order to let the light through. So they're not using any fossil fuel heat in this system. They're providing fresh vegetables for northern China. This system has, they've really scaled the system up in the past 20 years or so. This technology wasn't being used until then. But here, this is Dr. Gu, who used to work down the hall from me. Here it's April. I don't know if you can see this, but he tells me that cucumber crop has grown through the winter in a passively heated system in a climate that's colder than ours, without any fossil fuel heat. I think this is a very, very interesting technology. Now, you're going to hear more about cover cropping this afternoon, so I don't need to get into detail about this. Of course, there's potential to increase not just our soil organic matter content, but reduce our energy use with winter cover crops. And so I'm just going to leave it at that. We've got a slow-release fertilizer, essentially. This is key to reducing energy use on the farm. It is this is the sort of thing that requires an extra level of management. And from a purely economic perspective, it's probably cheaper, or it has been cheaper, to simply apply the fertilizer than to use a cover crop to meet those nitrogen needs. That said, in 2008, the folks who had the cover crops ended up saving money. And if we're going to see higher energy costs in the future and higher fertilizer costs in the future, this system may start to make sense from an economic perspective as well as an environmental perspective. Crimson clover, perhaps a little better adapted to Tennessee than to Kentucky. Now, reduced tillage systems. This happens to be a no-till tobacco system where there's a winter cover crop being used to provide some of the nitrogen needs and to build that soil organic matter, and then just a strip cultivation, a strip till that allows a very narrow band to be cultivated before those transplants are put into the ground. This is a fairly large-scale farm near Lexington, Kentucky, but similar technology can be used on a very small-scale farm. This is a little farm on a nasty clay hillside near Berea, Kentucky. It looks like a terrible place to grow anything, but this grower has been doing a no-till system for several years. You go down beneath her, into her beds there, and that soil is beautiful. And I tell you, the soil everywhere else on this hillside is just horrible. She's done a really nice job. Okay, our buildings tend to be fairly major energy users. On our farm, we can do the same sorts of things in terms of winterizing and weatherizing our buildings that we do in our farm buildings as we do in our homes. This is a matter of going through and trying to stop the air leaks, insulate, turn down the heat, using the smallest space that we can to block off unused areas, seek cost-effective heat sources. So wood tends to be a very cost-effective heat source, and many farms have access to wood. This is a pickup truck full of wood here, and the farmer in this case has a wood furnace that's being used to heat this little transplant production greenhouse in the background, and it also heats his home. It's interesting, though, that tiny little greenhouse is using as much energy, is using as much wood as his house, which is 10 times the size. You want to maintain those heating systems. It's probably important to think about our lighting. We can replace incandescent lights with compact fluorescents and LED lights and turn those lights off when they're not in use. From a greenhouse lighting perspective, it's hard to beat the efficiency of sodium vapor lighting. We've made great strides with LEDs, but they're still only in the same neighborhood, and they tend to be still more expensive than sodium vapor. In terms of farm equipment, there are opportunities, especially through the winter time, when you're not actively using that equipment, to tune, clean, lubricate the pumps, fans, blowers, compressors, all of that machinery, really to move towards low-pressure drip systems on timers. In terms of irrigation, that tends to be a very energy-efficient technology. If we're looking at machinery use during the farm season, anything we can do to reduce those trips across the field, reduce cultivation, and avoid excess horsepower. As I say, big tractors can be very efficient when used for big jobs, but not when they're used for small jobs. We can tune, clean, lubricate our equipment. We can reduce pickup truck use. It's interesting, particularly on small farms, the pickup truck tends to be a major contributor to farm energy use. So if you can combine trips into town, use the phone or internet where possible, rather than taking a trip, that can help reduce your farm energy use. Now this is a very interesting one. We've had this fellow is named Wayne Keith. He's an Alabama farmer who's come up to visit us at KSU a couple of times. He's running a wood-fueled pickup truck. And so these are gasifiers in the back that convert that wood essentially through a partial combustion process into a mixture of methane, hydrogen, and carbon monoxide. That hydrogen and methane is volatile. He pumps that straight into the air intake of his pickup truck and then runs off of wood that way. He can go down the highway 70 miles an hour on wood. This is another one of his pickup trucks. He's built several of these things, all wood-fueled from his sawmill waste. Okay, this is a little bit of a study that we've been conducting, looking at farm scale on energy use, but I'm not going to get into that because Tim is standing up. And so I'm going to stop right now and let you know that if you want any, if you want to contact me, ask questions, find out more about the work we're doing, there's my phone number. I think this is also in the binder. My email. You can look at energyfarms.net or organic.kysu.edu. And I want to thank this tremendous list of people who have helped with some of our projects and some of our research. And I want to thank you for your time and attention during this talk.